6 days of the path to the cross, and here we are on Friday. The theme that I chose for today is this essential theme of Holy Week, the mystery of Good Friday, the suffering God, suffering and overcoming. We went through all these different stages. It seems at some point very abstract, even what we're trying to do, this cosmic stages of creating the world, stages of creating the soul, stages of human being becoming more and more aware of who we are, becoming aware of our being in the world and relationships with the environment, with other human beings, with beings of natural world, with spiritual beings. And all this is a symphony of the story of incarnation, suffering, and death and resurrection of the Christ, which ultimately is also a story of death, suffering, and resurrection of the human being. The Maker meets, joins, follows his creation. The Maker, the Creator, follows into the abyss of earth existence, follows Adam, the fallen being, follows humanity, follows the human being, follows me and you. And at the moment of Good Friday, it's 3 p.m. of Good Friday, this meeting becomes fulfilled. Paradoxically, as it may seem, the meeting is the moment of death of Jesus of Nazareth. This is also through this understanding of actual religious Christian mysticism, this is also the moment of birth of Christ being, renewal and resurrection of the fallen human being, and the beginning of the long process where the entire creation that gradually was falling together with Adam will find a way to revive, to resurrect, to dematerialize, so that the next phase, next stage of the grand cosmic evolution can take place. And here human being receives that dignity of a priest, the dignity of a king, the dignity of the Messiah, the Anointed One, in the context, in the ramification of natural world, a cultural world. The death and resurrection of Christ is also death and resurrection of the consciousness of Christ within us, which means we are the Christ, predestined to lead the world into the future aeons. We contemplate that in a religious extent. Christianity is the contemplation of this deepest mystery for the last 2,000 years. Prior to that, the mystery religions, including that Yahwehic stream that we concentrated on, was contemplating that mystery. How can this be? People felt as if instinctively there is something missing in us, we're not complete. We still feel this today, maybe more than ever actually, as consciousness soul. This missing link of that even natural sciences are concerned with, anthropology, biology, anatomy, the missing link of the human evolution, this is the supersensible being of Christ. It becomes visible, shining from the cross on Good Friday. This is the missing link. Only by receiving this impulse, but taking him and his legacy, his message, taking him in the form of blood, his blood and his body, his bread and wine, we are actually adding, filling this missing link in our evolution, in world's evolution, which is the link that connects this world through human being, through human eye, with the world of the angels, archangels, with the spiritual world. And these stages that we have described in those 5 days, we will take them from a very particular existential point of view today. They hopefully will allow us to also awake a certain sensation of this destiny of the fall within us, every one of us today. I can start this with the question, are you aware that you are in the state of fall, that you're a fallen being? And to help us process this question, I would for a moment set aside any moral luggage, moral content of this question. Fallen in the context of one's human being in the original state is really a divine, supersensible, untouched, so to speak, pure being, untouched by death, illness, corruption, suffering. And today, obviously, these categories are daily categories of our existence. So are you aware of that? And how are you aware that we are actually having this civilization in the state of fallenness? This is a Good Friday question. I invite you to take it with you all through the day and the night, all through the Saturday, actually. In a certain sense, the answer, which is always an intimate answer, there is no need to exclaim anything, confess to our fallenness, but the intimate answer to that is the beginning of the religious life of the modern human being, which assumes its higher octave in the forming communities of Christians, communities of people who are aware of the foundation of a state of archetypical illness that we have found ourselves, that we are incarnated into, and longing, the flip side of this coin, longing to be healed. So this illness that I'm talking about is the illness of all illnesses. It's the origin of all illnesses. That is what you hear in the service, communion service of the Christian community, the act of consecration of the human being, the sickness of sin. Once in the past, these two categories, so let's say biological health category of sickness and sin, moral category, there were one. Around the time of Christ, they were already separated, but the further in the history, in the memory of mankind we go, these two categories were still way more united than they are today. And you see this in an example of the healing of the paralytic, fairly at the beginning of Christ's story, where they bring a man who's paralyzed. He heals him, and while he's healing him, he says, "Your sins are forgiven you." And this brings a wave of shock and antipathy in the beholders, the elite, priestly and intellectual elite who are observing his every step. How can you say that? Or who are you, God, to say you'll be healed? Only God can forgive sins. That's what they say. And out of this conversation, you can read into it that for Christ, actually, he brings back this consciousness that this is actually ultimately one source for both of these gestures of falling. So illness, all the way to physiological, mental illness, and sin are related. They have the same seed. And this seed enter humanity's story in that legend of the fall, the legend of Adam and Eve in paradise. We've pointed out that this paradisal story is related to the transition from the primordial epochs that is called in esoteric science Hyperborean epoch, transition to Lemuria. And this story, according to this map, esoteric map that Joseph Steiner gave us, the story of paradise would be placed around the middle of Lemuria. So they're abstract names, but in reality we try to, at least in the mood, recreate something of a landscape of the state of being that humanity was in. They look very different than us, of course. They were not yet incarnated in flesh like we are today, much more ethereal beings. And in fact, the reason why we became more and more flesh beings and incarnated is in the so-called intervention of Lucifer. So, that scene of the snake, temptation. We can't really blame poor Eve of breaking the rule if really she has no consciousness of right and wrong. As yet, that consciousness of good and evil only comes after the fruit from the forbidden tree, the tree of knowledge, is shared by Adam and Eve. So that is a picture for this original fall, and what we call in Christianity original sin is actually something that is still above and beyond the human being. If you think of this is a play, this is a dynamics between the spiritual beings, between the gods. Human being is on one hand a victim of that play, on the other hand, without yet knowing, is the subject of this play of powers in the spiritual world. Unaware of that yet, falls prey to this intervention of highly evolved spiritual being that Lucifer is. And that has consequences in that we're being clothed more and more into the world of matter. The spiritual eyes are shut off. The cherub will guard the entrance to the spiritual world, the threshold to the spiritual world from now on. And the human being enters the stream of evolution on Earth. And as evolution is, and you can make a little experiment with, for instance, with setting domino blocks. You precipitate, you push the first block, and then the chain of events starts happening. Now, of course, in terms of the human evolution, that is not so linear and so defined. You would have to imagine that each domino block triggers infinite number of domino paths with it. And as we go deeper into the world of matter, not only do we go deeper into the question who we are, but every single moral step in this development causes new karma to appear. So there are consequences, moral consequences for us and for the entire world with every single step that human being makes on this journey from paradise all the way to today. And as the first discovery, you can imagine that every step of this process is also self-discovery. It's not only evolutionary journey from the beginning of time towards now, today, perhaps in the future, but that actually is just also a picture of the human being, humanity, biographical as if journey to discover who we are or who we are not. This feeling of being in a state of fall is being discovered more and more, incompletion. And the first discovery that human being makes is that of death. In the early Lemurian time and in Hyperborean times, in the spiritual conditions that we were before the fall, there was no such thing as death. You can imagine that this pre-fall, pre-paradisal human being was way more extending into the kingdoms of nature, however they might have looked at that stage of evolution. We were connected with them much more. Human body was not so defined by contour and shape yet, much more ethereal. And of course, that means that the souls, the spiritual being that incarnates and excarnates in us, we call it life, were way more in the process of being breathed in by the earth and breathed out. Breathed in by the planet, entire cosmos, and breathed out. That would have character of existence. Neither birth nor death would be considered, or people would even not notice that such a thing happens actually. You'd have to maybe imagine just the sensation of light and darkness, perhaps. That would be the whole existence. Just breathing in and breathing out, we can think about our today's sensation of sleep. Sleep is often called the younger daughter of death. We go through this daily, nightly, for the duration of our lives. And unless you have significant problems with insomnia, you shouldn't be even noticing that you fall asleep and wake up instinctively, naturally. That's how it was with death in Adamic times. And Adamic humanity was still happy-go-lucky before the fall. And with the fall, with this turn towards the world of senses, the rudimentary foundations of the senses, rudimentary experiences of time begins actually too. Experience of time is always related to existential experience of death. If you think about it, you are not able actually to comprehend time before the thought of death and temporality appears in your consciousness. Then we start rushing, also in our spiritual development. So this first discovery, you can imagine a human being descending from the heights, light-filled eternity, into the time and space more. God's Elohim say to Adam, now you will be toiled this land in the sweat of your forehead, and you, says to Eve, you will bear children in pain. They're completely new categories that human being becomes aware of together with death. So toil, hardship, and pain. That is the most paradoxical pain that you can imagine. That in order to bring another human being into the world, we have to go through extreme pain. Mothers have to, in a certain sense, die in order to bring new life in. So already there on that level, we are confronting pain, suffering, death, temporality. This is the story of the human being at the very basic bottom of that. And of course, out of this, on one hand, the religious feeling is developed, and that religious feeling developing humanity in confrontation with toil, with suffering, with death, assumes its expression in the personality of Abel. Abel is the first religious human being, Abel. And on the other hand, the reaction to that, very human, understandable reaction, is to create a culture, to create forms and techniques, technologies to actually address these fundamental issues that we discover due to our existence on Earth. So how can we overcome or make our life easier? That's the question of Cain, the creator, initiator of culture, and not only culture but technology too. His three sons. One is the inventor of and manufacturer of the instruments, musical instruments. How can we help one another to survive suffering, existential suffering, through beauty, through music, through art? The other one is the initiator of farming and all the technology related to helping us to go through the toil of day, so tools, all the way to machines, all the way to technologies of today. This is all legacy of Cain. And the third is the master of the elements. He's the smith, has wisdom of the materials. He knows how to bend metals, and he knows how to make out of lithium batteries that will drive our automobiles that he builds. This is all a response and a reaction, understandably, from a certain point of view, on that suffering that is the cause of the fall. And you know that story, Cain kills Abel. There's a reason for that, not just out of sheer hate. And yet with that story, when we talk about Cain and Abel, we are already in the stage of development of the human culture that we called Atlantis. And in Atlantis, additionally to death, toil, and suffering of birth, comes the discovery of a crime, murder, the original murder. It doesn't necessarily mean that people are so holier than thou, and the murder would not exist before that at all. No, we have become aware that it's wrong to murder one another, to commit crimes. There's a difference. Just like look at the animals today. We have dogs or animals, wild animals. Of course, they kill, but they are innocent. They're innocent of any crime. Can you understand that? It would be very difficult if we have courts for lions and trials for tigers because they killed poor antelopes on the steppes of Africa, and go to jail for animals for 80 years for killing an antelope. There is no category of good and evil there. And so human being detaching more and more from the spiritual heights becomes, of course, with every step, more and more aware, morally aware. And you have to imagine that this moment with this, in the biblical language, regardless what the situation actually means, in a symbol language, when Cain kills Abel, this is the moment when humanity discovers that it's wrong to commit such thing as taking someone else's life for a reason. And this becomes an imprint in the memory of etheric memory of the human being. And ever since then, human beings look back at the story of Cain and Abel and know this is deplorable. This is very, very deep level of fallenness. Out of the stream of Cain comes this individuality that in the Bible is called Enoch. Enoch is the first initiate. Out of the stream of Cain, you have to imagine these inventors of how to make our life more livable on earth. They, of course, according to the biblical story, suppressed due to this crime against the other half of humanity. They have to flee. So Cainites are always on the go. They are homeless, inventors, they're artists, they are engineers. They're never at home anywhere. They have to break through. They're magicians, so to speak. And out of this stream, at some point, this individuality of Enoch appears. Enoch is the 8th after Adam in the genealogy. So kind of an octave, new human being, again, new emanation of humanity. And this Enoch is the first one who is an initiate, which means that in the Atlantean times, someone there, stream of Cain, started looking for the way to not only preserve but develop wisdom out of our connection with the earth, which is different than the original Abel's revelation, divine wisdom that was given and protected by Yahweh. That's how it is. That's how you should live. Do not cross the line. You will be happy. That's a very primitive picture of the Yahwehic law-based spirituality. Cain is never happy with that. He has to. He cannot do differently. He creates centers. These are those centers, mystery centers of Atlantis, where today what we have as technology, as sciences, the seeds from that are planted in those Atlantean mysteries. At some point, this Enoch, and we know that there is this apocryphal book of Enoch, beautiful document, is the first one who gives account of going through death. You see, initiation becomes response to the natural condition of death. Human beings, out of their culture, out of their wisdom, have found a way to take the sting of death from her by creating conditions in which selected human beings can go through death for 3 days, with the only difference that due to wisdom and know-how how to do it, even though their ether bodies are elevated from the grave of their physical form, physical bodies, they are supported and allowed to go back so that human being comes back to life after 3 days. This is the big first victory of Cain and victory of the human being above death. Because what does it mean? That human being, during those 3 days of the temple sleep, is actually becoming aware. Life, beginning of life and end of life, is just a fragment. In reality, we forgot about it, but we are way larger and bigger than that. This is an episode that is complemented with a good amount of suffering. But now I know, says Enoch in the book of Enoch, this is the first account of initiation. That's on one hand is this overcoming of this, the biggest specter, the biggest judge, the biggest threat of humanity, death, already then, however, kept in the hidden of the mysteries, Atlantean mysteries, and later on, for the selected ones. They typically would become either leaders, spiritual leaders of humanity, or like in the case of pharaohs, what I was telling you previously, the leaders of entire nations. It wasn't for everyone. So the human beings would, the entire societies would be inspired to live and thrive by looking at their leaders, kings, pharaohs, or priests, initiate, and that would generate in them hope. There is meaning behind our suffering. There is meaning. There is a way out of here. You see, through that, of course, you see another signature of the Christ being. Still, from the heights of the spiritual world, through these initiation rites, Christ makes himself known to the initiates. And in many, many forms of ancient religion forms, or all the way to Greek theater, that announcement becomes more and more known in different pictures, different variations. But each of the mystery temples of the past is actually specific take on the phenomena of the God coming close to the earth, the one who at some point will cause and allow the resurrection, overcoming of death for all of us. No longer exclusive take. Concurrently, around the same time, mid-Atlantis, let's say, this personality is described in the book of Genesis by name Enosh. Sounds almost similar. And Enosh is a Hebrew word that actually means man. Adam means a human being. Human beings sounds, Adam is something really noble. It really has this fullness in it yet. Even though it means literally from earth, but it connects with the cycles and spaces and depths of evolution. Enosh, in this word, linguistically, one can go to all the way to the word core that also is behind the word illness. Enosh is the first human being who's actually more or less a type of a contemporary, a human being devoid of any aura. It's just subject to the working of the forces of nature and destiny. And this is when the illness steps in for the first time. So again, you may imagine that in the following way, that perhaps there was symptoms or some forms of illness before Atlantis, but human being became aware of it with Enosh. Illness. So we have death, suffering, toil, hardship, illness. See, with every step, human being falls deeper and deeper in the world of matter, in the world of existential paradox. Of course, today we're born into the world where all those categories are as a matter of fact. Nobody asks, well, where did illness come from, or when did death began? They did begin at some point. They did begin at some point of our coming into the world. Through these existential hardships and suffering, human being not only becomes aware of our distance from the origins, but also starts sensing and feeling that we are here in this condition of our evolution, prey of the influences of the beings that are actually antagonistic to the Christ. The question of evil, it's not something that we're born with. Even today, when we're not born equipped with understanding of evil, even today you may ask yourself very existential questions. What is evil? Very philosophical category on one hand, and you can write books about it, read books or lectures. You can have some answers then, and even give people advice until something bad is really happening to you existentially, that you really are subject and you fall prey, you're victim to evil, then I dare say, and I apologize if I offend your feeling somewhere, but all that you know about evil is worthless when you actually are victim to evil. So on one hand, we have this legacy and knowledge, perhaps what it is, philosophical, but evil is something when it happens to you, then you're isolated, you suffer, you're traumatized, it's painful. Now, this happening as we live, between now and that time, there is this whole generational, what they call trauma, evil, that not only on an intellectual, historical, theoretical level we are somehow aware, but it also lives incarnated in us all the way to our bodies. Human being became gradually aware, but that's something that is a part of the existence on Earth. You can escape that even if you try. And interestingly, even if you try escape that, it will sting you from another side. So it's something that belongs to our destiny on Earth. And here comes this description of the flood. Again, remember, we spoke about it a few times, change of conditions. Noah brings humanity out of the chaos. In part, we know that this chaos of the flood was generated also by the fact that with Enosh, not only illness comes, but also worship of idols. That's in the language of the Bible, language of the Talmudic legends of the Jews. What does it mean? That means that there were some attempts, and there were spiritual technologies, so to speak, methods to, through mysteries, certain mysteries during Atlantis, to call on and to come into relationship with the spiritual being from the underworld, as we say it mythologically. So from the adversarial side of the destiny of the human being. And they were called into the world maybe to help overcoming this and that, or achieve such and such a goal. But in essence, they wreak havoc, and they also participated in bringing this cataclysm of the end of that entire epoch and era, which ended with the flood. This sounds like a fairy tale, but is it? In our times, we have many, so to speak, mirror reflections of these deeds. We don't call it magic anymore, of course. People would laugh at me or you that you call it magic when you think about, for instance, the Project Manhattan. 120,000 people were at some point at the peak of that project involved in creating what we call a nuclear atomic weapon, which is, from a certain point, is nothing else but actually inviting the submaterial forces of chaos that were discovered a few years before that bomb was created. Something that comes from what mythologically, in a religious nomenclature in the past, was called hell, so underworld. We have invited these forces through incredible powers of intellect, knowledge, wisdom, Cainitic gesture, in order to win a war. And by this, we have created a world that is a ticking bomb. So all the peace that we have since 1945 is actually a laughable caricature of what peace is. It's a peace that we have to sustain and keep in order to avoid self-annihilation. So in a modern materialistic language of intellect, in a way one can say, now I understand what these mythological pictures of the betrayal of the mysteries in Atlantis are all about. Also coming into contact with demonic forces, spiritual forces, but in a way that this contact is done through kind of egoistic or self-guided reasons. And so Noah saves part of the humanity, selected part of the humanity, and this new type of human being goes through the flood. The post-Atlantean epoch begins. So Noah sends the first students. His first messengers are the 7 rishis, the founders of the ancient Indian epoch. Noah, we have to imagine, is not really man of flesh. It's a human being, spiritual human being, an initiate that not necessarily touches the ground, but works out of the spiritual sphere, and sends, blesses, initiates entire culture. So later he sends Zarathustra, the founder of the Persian epoch, out of which Babylonia is developed later. Then he says Hermes, the founder of Egyptian culture. Then he has this meeting with Abraham. Remember, we spoke about it yesterday, through which meeting between Abraham and Noah, Melchizedek, actually Abraham and Abrahamic stream receives its own legitimate placement in this rainbow of cultures, post-Atlantean cultures. So on one hand, we have this Noah, this kind of mythological spiritual being, and as a shadow version, figure in the biblical language, shadow that Noah cast in a certain sense, is this Job. The book of Job, one of the most touching, beautiful flowers of the ancient consciousness included in the Old Testament, the book of Job, highly interpreted, heavily misinterpreted. The book of Job is a story of an individual. So that's already a signature that makes us think about our epoch, our time. And even if I say 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, the beginning of post-Atlantean epoch, we can still relate to that. Even though our constitution and psychology has changed a lot during those 12 to 10,000 years, of course, technology anyway, we're still more or less on the same level of we're developing this one type of humanity that is symbolically depicted in the personality and the story of Job. A happy man, very successful businessman from Los Angeles, who has 10 children and everything goes really well. And he is, moreover, a very religious, very devoted human being. One could say, for all intents and purposes, he is really blameless. And yet, out of the blue, one morning, first of all, his sons and daughters are destroyed. They fell prey to terrible misfortune, illness. Then his business, he loses everything, his children, his possessions, his fame, and at the end, he also gets stricken by a terrible illness. So all this leads him out on the street. He becomes a beggar, isolated and alienated, abandoned by his former peers, family, and friends, with the exception of 3 friends who are still with him, and they go in a conversation with him where he is asking these basic questions that every one of us, if you are in connection with yourself, at some point must have asked or will ask: why is this happening to me? What have I done? What is the reason of suffering? And the second part of the book is his conversation with these friends. So when 3 friends, we know is a picture, a picture of the forces of the soul. And his soul, conversation with his own soul, and these friends trying to convince him, if you would only accept that God punished you, you say that you are good and that you're blameless, but maybe there's something about your behavior that you don't know about. And here, Job, modern human being, is categorically rejecting this type of inauthentic humiliation, because he knows, actually, he lives in communion with God, and he knows that he would be a liar. He would be kind of lying to his own God, trying to take away his own suffering by admitting that he done something wrong. He doesn't have any reason to do that. So you see, in that book, human being of post-Atlantean epoch is in this conversation where we are still in the intimate moment of our times, in hardship of our times. What is the source of my suffering? If I am already trying and living as a decent human being, and through that, at some point in the book, a 4th individuality appears, Elihu, that's his name, a young man who comes and invites Job to look at the story, not so much from the his individual point of his suffering, but cosmic suffering, so to speak. And this is, in the biblical language, a very strong indicator of the mystery of Christ, who is not only approaching a human being gradually to join us in our suffering, but also with every level and step of human beings fall and decline into matter and discoveries of this of these shady sides of our existence, Christ suffers too, cosmically. He suffers for Adam, for the lost human being, for the lost sheep. And when Job is able to see that in his suffering, his personal suffering, is actually not so much his own fault, or it's not for him, but something of a universal suffering of the human being is reflected, the suffering of Christ. This is a moment when there is a shift and turn in his destiny, and slowly but surely he gets redeemed and comes back to the original state of grace, however, equipped with this incredible knowledge that suffering gave him. One can maybe even say so much that there is no more important book today than the book of Job. Problem is that it's so heavily misinterpreted. I encourage you to read that story and live with this. It's a story of a modern human being in a search of Christ, in a search of understanding the reason for our misery. On the way of this self-discovery of Job, this is chapter 40 and 41, he becomes aware that behind these symptoms of illness, death, crime, toil, symptoms, there are actually reasons, spiritual beings that cause us suffering and unhappiness of this world. And this is the first time in the canonical Old Testament where these adversarial forces are presented to the reader. Prior to that, they were presented by Enoch in the ancient book of Enoch. He speaks exactly about the same beings that are called in the language of the Old Testament Behemoth and Leviathan. Behemoth and Leviathan. This is William Blake's commentary illustration to the book of Job, 1826. And that's William Blake's imagination of Behemoth and Leviathan. Two beings, they are very beautifully described in the book of Job. God, the creator, introduces Job through his suffering to the perception, reveals to him perception of adversarial forces. One has a character of a kind of a mighty mechanical beast, mechanical, powerful. His bones are made out of steel, of rods of steel. And the other one is way more organic, dwells in the waters, etheric waters, so to speak, of the world, has a character of snake. Not only one adversary, but two forces that from certain point of view are even adversarial to each other, but their common goal is destruction and causing suffering to the human being. That's a discovery of the post-Atlantean epoch. In other cultures, you have this duality of evil too, always. This is the scene when Odysseus is caught between Scylla and Charybdis, two monsters. According to Homer, one was in Strait of Messina, between Sicily and Italian peninsula. On his way, Odysseus has to go through this threshold between two monsters. You know this saying between Scylla and Charybdis, between the rock and the hard place. Yet another example of this duality of evil that human beings slowly became aware of is the Nordic mythology with Fenris, the wolf, and the snake Midgard. So Ahriman and Lucifer are by no means new concepts. This is not something that we just discovered last century through Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner names these beings with particular names. The spirit of darkness, Ahriman, from the Persian language, and Lucifer as this being of light, adversarial, controversial, contrastful to the spirit of darkness, but duality is there. Between that duality, human being is crucified. Between that duality, human being is crucified. So this is this icon of the Golgotha event. And you remember from the Gospel of Luke that there's a conversation Jesus speaks with this evildoer on his side. One of them is being promised salvation, and the other one is silent, doesn't say anything. So all this is mystery language gestures where this dynamic between the Christ and the adversarial forces already begins. The silent one with who doesn't say a word with that adversarial force, Christ will have conversation after death during the silent Saturdays. Of course, this conversation goes forth all through the end of times. But for our intellectual purposes, the direction there is that a human being discovers through these hardships, illness, death, we discover that the reason for our suffering is a cosmic reason. On one hand, there are beings who are adversarial to the human being. In the language of the New Testament, they're called Satan and devil. And on the other hand, that in order to bring the human being back from this strait and this conflict and this digestion between two adversarial forces, this highest spiritual being decided to take that route, to follow the path of Adam into suffering, into illness, into death, all the way to the point of death on the cross. No other religion at least in our epoch has this element. Imagine this is such a paradox of a religious experience that God, the highest being to which we aspire and want to be like, actually does the opposite. He aspires and follows human being even into the most lowliest and most difficult elements of our existence, all the way to the point of death. But unlike human being, he goes through this death. And this is where the new ray of hope and the new message that is so anti-spirit of our time, that there is not only life after death, this is already in our times more or less scientific fact through research of George Ritchie, for instance, but that the humanity as a whole, through the power of the risen one, who is now proceeding, just as he was following Adam, following us into the abyss of death and decline, all the way to submaterial forces. Now he's breaking through and spearheading a way out of this hole of initiation, this grave of initiation that we have dug ourselves in, trying to escape in shame the feeling that we're fallen. The grave of the earth. He rises up and he walks out of the grave of the earth and does this. Opens the way for all of us, and that, of course, is this moment when completely new vision, completely new soul qualities and consciousness, completely new life forces, and completely new form, physical body is being generated out of these forces of the risen one, out of his digesting into the world, so to speak, out of the act of what we called transubstantiation. Transubstantiation is not only something that is happening at the altar, we see it and it is presented and happening in us and for us all the way to the level of sense perception, but it doesn't end there. It is for us to know that since the time of resurrection, this is a process whereby entire nature and world creation goes through this gradual process of transubstantiation. So now, not deeper, but every time Christ transubstantiates part of existence, of reality, spiritual, physical, etheric, the effect of that is what we called apocalypse, revelation. So we start seeing the effect of this activity of the Christ being in the world, in a history, even all the way to ourselves. Maybe nothing more painful than the awareness of our pain. Do animals suffer? When you step on a paw of your dog, of course they suffer, right? But are they aware that they suffer? Meaning, are they aware and can they ask themselves a question, God, why did you make me a dog? And why do I suffer so much with this owner of mine who's always keeping me hungry, only feeds me once a day? That they have that capacity. So the only being that has that capacity to reflect upon our own suffering is the human being. And because of that, perhaps there is no bigger suffering than just that. So, for instance, you can think about it. Well, the whole question, grand question of trauma that our civilization is so occupied with is nothing else but dwelling and digging, trying to understand of your own suffering. And by doing this, you suffer even more. That's a paradox of modern psychoanalysis. There is no healing in that, per se. Healing must come from somewhere else. Healing can only come through the being from the outside, the being that will carry your suffering for you, or through which you can commune and connect and say, that being, even though divine and innocent, took part of my suffering. This is the greatest cultural invention of the modern human being, that we can imagine that there is a being that carries our cross. And there are different consequences of that too. For instance, the story of Jonah, the prophet Jonah. He has a mission, he's being called to go from the Holy Land to Babylonia, to Nineveh, today in Iraq, and to warn the city that if they won't change their behaviors, God will destroy the city. He doesn't want to do that. It's a modern situation. And imagine that out of your comfort zone, you're being called, literally. You know that you have to do something against yourself even. And this very human story that he really tries everything he can not to do that what is asked for him by the destiny. And at some point, he ends up in a ship trying to escape to Spain, and there's a big storm. So he asks the sailors, if you want to survive, you have to throw me into the waters, because I know it's the God's fury because of my lack of will. And they do it. However, he's being caught by the great fish. The great fish swallows Jonah for 3 days and 3 nights. And there in the belly of this great fish, chapter 2 of the book of Jonah, he sings the song of praise and glory. You see, again, this mythology is weaving together with facts of history. We have, first of all, a picture of initiation again, that he is only able to reconcile with his higher self, with his actual destiny, which he doesn't even want to be aware of, through suffering and going through initiation, through suffering. And when he's finally reconciled, he says, okay, God, now I will do what you ask me to do. Unequipped with the way I am, I'm going to go to Nineveh and tell them that they better change their evil ways or you will destroy them. And the second stage of his drama is happening there, namely, strange as it may seem, he's very successful. So, to his own shock, they listen to him, they're foreigners, They listen to the word of him, Jonah the prophet, who is delivering the message of Yahweh, a different God, foreign God, and they become better human beings. And this is a reason for Jonah to be very, very, very upset with his God and disappointed. This is such a human story at this point. Again, why? When you say he did what God asked him to do, he should be happy. He went through hardship to go through this. He had to change his being. He doesn't understand, how is this? I thought my God was supposed to punish them, my enemies. The Babylonians were suppressing my folk for thousands of years, the powerful. So why are you sending me, a faithful person, making me go through hardships of life, and they actually are now better, so you don't have to destroy them? How strange. And he's very disappointed. And the end of the story, he becomes a hermit, sore, upset with his God, upset with everything, very modern human being. And he lives outside of the walls of the city, where God plants for him a bean, a plant. And so, at least for a moment, in that fairy tale biblical story, Jonah has a place of repose, of shade, and can rest. However, God sends a worm who eats that leaf and eats the plant. And again, for the third time, Jonah is very upset that there's no repose for him. He has done everything right, and yet his life is miserable, and God is against him, and he doesn't understand why. And then God tells him, did you grow the plant? Did you create the worm, the bug? So now listen, everything that is happening in your life is actually not so much about you, Jonah. You're part of divine plan. You are a neuron in a great brain of humanity where everything is connected. Don't take everything so personally. Today, my translation of that book, but it's such a message there. And imagine that when at some point of the 3 years, we read that always at the beginning of Passion Time. People are challenging Christ when he's healing. They say, give us a sign that you are the divine being. You know, you make all these wonders and everything, but that's not enough for us. Give us a sign. And then he says, the only sign that will be given to this generation is the sign of Jonah. This is what he means. He says, you, modern human being, are so full of yourself that even your suffering you think is your own, but it's not. You will only understand the meaning of suffering when you will leave the grave of your replica of your own self, which also where you're dwelling within your own suffering, and turn and open upon the suffering of the person next to you. And take it in. And then in that you will discover that there is a being that suffers for all of you. That's me. That's the Christ. So we are really at the beginning of that, even with this great discovery of empathy. Just a few decades ago, we discover empathy. It's a new thing. You see, and with discovery of empathy, you have a palpable proof of the forces of the risen one reversing this course of events. Why? Maybe people were empathic. We have to say, I'm sure they were empathic thousands of years ago. Yes, but now we can extract it from us and say there is a function of the human being, of the soul, of consciousness that we call empathy. What is it? This is what it is. And we create ways for one another to understand. So we're empathic. What will be the next stage that we will discover something beautiful in us? We will discover in the future. And yet another, there are things in us that they are there, but we can't name them. Once we name them, they become tool of healing for generations to come. But all this is only possible through our conscious approaching, conscious confrontation with the source of our suffering, that is the adversaries. This is why in the book of Job, it says about Behemoth that he is the beginning of God's way. Very strange statement. Behemoth is the beginning of God's way. Behemoth, when we translate it to anthroposophical language, is Ahriman, What does it mean that Ahriman is the beginning of God's way? It sounds almost blasphemous. That means that through our suffering, through taking in and understanding, accepting suffering in the world, we near the threshold, and two beings, that human being approaching the threshold, always will find standing there and separating us from our divine origins, from the spiritual world, from the truth, is Ahriman and Lucifer. So through suffering, we may come close to perception of the source of our suffering, the spiritual beings, Ahriman and Lucifer, and this is the beginning of her psychological, the cultural, then natural process of redemption through initiation. We all have to go through the path of Jonah. We all have to go through Elijah, who at some point, after he challenges the authorities, he has to flee. He goes to Horeb, to the same place where Moses had these amazing, super sensible visions. You could see Christ in smoke, in volcanic fire, in dust, in wind. Elijah seeks conversation with God, sees all those things, experiences them, the hurricane, the dust storm, the sandstorm, but they're only just that. There is no voice of God speaking to him. And then he sits and prays, and for the first time, first human being who has this experience, the voice of God speaks to him as a gentle whisper in his heart, which is another quality of the human being of our times. God does not speak to us through some extravagant, flashy, virtual reality ways, but we have to first learn how to quiet down, how to go into the mode of the Saturn day, and there in the reflective, calm way, in humility, learn to listen to this gentle whisper of our conscience.